Portland, Oregon, May 15, 2024. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Portland State University campus as thousands gathered for what appeared to be an ordinary graduation ceremony. Among the sea of black caps and gowns, one figure stood out remarkably. Grace Parker, at 95 years old, was about to receive her master's degree in history with highest honors, making her one of the oldest graduates in the institution's history. Local news outlets had covered the story as an inspiring tale of lifelong learning and determination. Feature articles painted Grace as a symbol of perseverance, a grandmother who refused to let age define her capabilities. Television segments showed her walking carefully across campus, her wrinkled hands clutching textbooks, her eyes bright with academic passion behind wire-rimmed glasses. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. What the cheerful news stories failed to mention was the darker catalyst behind Grace's unprecedented academic journey. The university's administration knew there was more to her story, but they had agreed to keep certain details confidential at her request. Only a handful of professors and the dean of the history department understood the true weight Grace carried beneath her graduation robes. Grace had enrolled at Portland State in the fall of 2018, just after her 89th birthday. While other students in their early 20s complained about the difficulty of balancing coursework with social lives, Grace approached her studies with an intensity that unsettled even the most dedicated scholars. She was always the first to arrive at the library when it opened at 7 in the morning, and security guards often found her still there when they locked the doors at midnight. Her research focus was peculiarly specific. While most history graduate students explored broad topics spanning decades or centuries, Grace narrowed her attention to a single year, 1952. More specifically, she devoted 6 years of intensive academic work to studying criminal investigation techniques, forensic methodology, and procedural protocols used by law enforcement in rural Oregon during the early 1950s. Professor Michael Harrison, her thesis advisor, later recalled that Grace's knowledge of this particular period was encyclopedic and deeply personal. She could recite details about police procedures, evidence collection methods, and interrogation practices with the precision of someone who had lived through them intimately. When he questioned why she had chosen such a narrow focus, Grace simply replied that she needed to understand how justice could fail so completely. The breakthrough in understanding Grace's motivation came not from her words, but from a routine background check conducted by the university's archives department. While processing her request for access to historical police records stored in the Oregon State Archives, a research librarian named Jennifer Collins discovered something troubling. Grace Parker's name appeared in multiple case files from 1952, not as a researcher or historian, but as a person of interest in one of Oregon's most haunting unsolved cases. In October of 1952, 3 children from Willow Creek Elementary School vanished during what should have been a routine field trip to a nearby nature preserve. The children, aged 7 to 9, were last seen in the supervision of their young teacher, 23-year-old Grace Mitchell, who would later become Grace Parker after marriage. The investigation that followed consumed the small community of Willow Creek, located approximately 60 miles south of Portland, and ultimately destroyed Grace's teaching career despite the absence of any formal charges. The case file photographs showed a very different Grace. In black and white images taken during police questioning, a frightened young woman stared at the camera with hollow eyes. Report after report documented her consistent testimony. She had taken 8 children on the approved field trip, accompanied by 2 parent volunteers. During a nature scavenger hunt, 3 children wandered beyond the designated area. Despite immediate search efforts involving Grace, the parent volunteers, and eventually dozens of community members and law enforcement officers, the children were never found. Grace maintained her innocence throughout weeks of intensive investigation. She provided detailed accounts of the day's events, submitted to multiple interrogations, and cooperated fully with authorities. Yet suspicion clung to her like a shadow. In small-town America of the 1950s, the disappearance of children demanded accountability, and the young teacher became the most visible target for a community's grief and rage. No physical evidence ever connected Grace to any wrongdoing. No witnesses contradicted her account. No motive could be established. Nevertheless, the weight of suspicion proved insurmountable. Grace resigned from her teaching position in December of 1952 and left Willow Creek entirely by the following spring. She married Thomas Parker in 1954, moved to Portland, and spent the next 6 decades living a quiet, almost invisible life, working as a secretary and raising 2 children who knew nothing of their mother's past. The case of the missing children remained officially open, but effectively dormant. As decades passed and principals in the investigation died, the files were archived and largely forgotten. The families of the missing children eventually scattered, some moving away to escape painful memories, others passing away with their questions unanswered. Then, in 2018, something changed. Grace Parker, now widowed and in her late 80s, made a decision that would ultimately rewrite history. She enrolled in university not to fulfill a lifelong dream of education, but to pursue something far more urgent: the truth about what really happened in October of 1952, and why an innocent woman's life had been destroyed by an investigation that failed in ways she was only beginning to understand. What Grace had discovered in the years leading up to her enrollment would prove that her decades of silence had been protecting not herself, but the memory of those 3 lost children, until she could finally prove what actually occurred in those woods 72 years ago. Willow Creek, Oregon, October 14, 1952. The events that would haunt Grace Mitchell for 7 decades began on an unremarkable autumn morning. Willow Creek Elementary School, a modest 2-story brick building serving a community of fewer than 3,000 residents, prepared for its annual fall nature expedition. Grace, in only her 2nd year of teaching, had volunteered to lead the 3rd grade excursion to Henderson Nature Preserve, a densely forested area 2 miles from town, known for its hiking trails and abundant wildlife. The approved itinerary was straightforward. Grace would supervise 8 students with assistance from 2 parent volunteers, Margaret Henderson and Robert Chen. They would arrive at the preserve at 9:30 in the morning, conduct a nature scavenger hunt until 11, eat packed lunches at the picnic area, and return to school by 1 in the afternoon. The school principal, Thomas Bradford, had personally approved the trip and reviewed the safety protocols with Grace the previous week. The group departed on schedule in Robert Chen's large passenger vehicle. The children were excited, chattering about the leaves they hoped to collect and the animals they might observe. Grace had prepared educational materials about native Oregon flora and fauna, determined to make the experience both enjoyable and instructive. Margaret Henderson brought her camera to document the day, snapping pictures of the children as they entered the preserve. The scavenger hunt began without incident. Grace divided the children into 2 groups of 4, assigning 1 parent volunteer to each group while she moved between them. The list included items like pine cones, acorns, yellow leaves, and smooth river stones. The children scattered across the designated area, a clearly marked section of the preserve, bounded by distinctive white trail markers and a small creek that served as a natural boundary. At approximately 10:45, Grace conducted a head count as the groups reconvened near the picnic area. 5 children were present. 3 were missing: 7-year-old Emily Watson, 8-year-old David Sullivan, and 9-year-old Rebecca Torres. Grace immediately asked the other children when they had last seen the missing 3. The answers were troublingly vague. Some children recalled seeing them near the creek 15 minutes earlier. Others thought they had wandered toward the eastern trail markers. Grace instructed Margaret Henderson to remain with the 5 children while she and Robert Chen began searching. They called the children's names, following the trails in different directions. The preserve, though not vast, contained enough dense vegetation and winding paths to hide 3 small children easily. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, Robert Chen ran back to his vehicle to drive to the nearest house with a telephone and call for help. By 11:30, the Willow Creek Volunteer Fire Department had mobilized a search party. By noon, the county sheriff's office had dispatched additional personnel. By 2 in the afternoon, more than 50 community members were combing through Henderson Nature Preserve, calling for Emily, David, and Rebecca. Grace remained at the search site, providing information to authorities and retracing her steps repeatedly, desperately trying to understand how 3 children could vanish so completely in such a short span of time. The initial investigation focused on the possibility that the children had become lost and would be found frightened but unharmed. As sunset approached without any trace of the missing 3, the tone shifted. Detective Harold Morrison, the lead investigator from the county sheriff's office, began asking different questions. His attention turned increasingly toward Grace Mitchell, the young teacher who had been responsible for the children's safety. The interrogations began that evening and continued for weeks. Detective Morrison questioned Grace's timeline repeatedly, searching for inconsistencies in her account. He interviewed the other children, the parent volunteers, and anyone who had been near the preserve that day. He examined Grace's background, her teaching record, her personal life, and her relationships within the community. He found nothing incriminating, yet his suspicion never wavered. The community's reaction was swift and merciless. Parents demanded answers. Local newspapers ran front-page stories speculating about what might have happened. Grace's photograph appeared alongside headlines that carefully avoided direct accusations but implied culpability through association. She received threatening letters. Strangers shouted at her on the street. The school board placed her on administrative leave while the investigation continued. Margaret Henderson and Robert Chen provided statements supporting Grace's account completely. They confirmed that she had followed all safety protocols, that the children had wandered off during a brief moment when adult supervision was divided between 2 groups, and that Grace had responded immediately and appropriately when she realized the children were missing. Their testimonies should have cleared Grace of any wrongdoing, yet Detective Morrison seemed oddly dismissive of their accounts. As November turned to December, the search efforts diminished. The preserve had been examined thoroughly multiple times. Search dogs had found no scent trails leading beyond the immediate area. Divers checked the creek and nearby ponds, despite the shallow water making drowning highly unlikely. No physical evidence of the children was discovered anywhere. The case file grew thick with reports, witness statements, and investigative notes. Detective Morrison documented every aspect of Grace Mitchell's life in meticulous detail, yet he seemed curiously less thorough in exploring other possibilities. When Grace's attorney later requested information about other potential suspects or alternative theories, the responses were vague and incomplete. The investigation appeared to have tunnel vision, focused almost exclusively on the young teacher, while other avenues remained largely unexplored. Grace resigned from her position in December, unable to endure the hostile environment any longer. The official investigation continued into the spring of 1953, but without new evidence or developments, it gradually lost momentum. The case was never officially closed, remaining technically active but practically abandoned. The 3 missing children were never found, their fate never determined, their families never granted closure. Grace married Thomas Parker in 1954 and deliberately built a life far removed from Willow Creek. She never taught again. She rarely spoke about the events of October 1952, even to her husband and children. The trauma of that day and the nightmare that followed became a sealed chapter of her existence, something to be endured privately rather than processed openly. For more than 6 decades, Grace carried the weight of those 3 lost children and the community's unspoken conviction that she bore responsibility for their disappearance. She attended therapy sporadically over the years, struggling with guilt not for what she had done, but for what she had failed to prevent. The question haunted her constantly. How had 3 children vanished so completely under her watch? Then, in the spring of 2017, something happened that would change everything. Grace received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Patricia Morrison, daughter of the deceased Detective Harold Morrison. Patricia had been sorting through her father's belongings following his death in 2016 when she discovered something disturbing in his private papers, something that suggested the investigation of 1952 had been deliberately corrupted from the very beginning. What Patricia Morrison found hidden in her father's personal effects would ultimately lead Grace Parker to enroll in university at age 89, embarking on an academic journey designed not for personal enrichment, but as a methodical, scholarly quest to expose a truth that had been buried for 65 years beneath lies, manipulation, and a calculated betrayal of justice that protected a killer while destroying an innocent woman's life. Portland, Oregon, April 2017. Patricia Morrison had spent 3 weeks sorting through her father's belongings after his death at age 89. Detective Harold Morrison had lived alone for the final decade of his life, his home filled with decades of accumulated possessions. Patricia, his only child, faced the overwhelming task of deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to discard from a lifetime of memories stored in boxes, filing cabinets, and closets. The letter appeared in an unexpected place. Patricia was clearing out her father's bedroom closet when she noticed a loose floorboard beneath the carpet. Curious, she pried it up and discovered a small metal box hidden in the hollow space below. The box was locked, but Patricia found a key among her father's personal effects that fit perfectly. Inside the box were documents that seemed oddly out of place among typical personal papers. There were photographs of 3 children, clearly from the 1950s based on their clothing and the image quality. There was a folded map of Henderson Nature Preserve with certain areas marked in red pencil, and there was an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Detective Harold Morrison in handwriting that trembled with age or illness. Patricia opened the envelope carefully. The letter inside was dated March 1966 and written on lined notebook paper. The author identified himself as Frank Peterson, and the content was a deathbed confession. Peterson described himself as the janitor at Willow Creek Elementary School in 1952, the uncle by marriage to Detective Harold Morrison, and the person responsible for the disappearance of Emily Watson, David Sullivan, and Rebecca Torres. The letter detailed events that had never appeared in any official police report. According to Peterson's account, he had been at Henderson Nature Preserve on the morning of October 14, 1952, despite having no official reason to be there. He had been checking on an old hunting cabin he occasionally used, located approximately half a mile beyond the preserve's designated boundaries, in an area the school group was never supposed to access. Peterson wrote that he encountered the 3 children by accident. They had wandered far beyond the white trail markers, drawn by the sight of deer in the distance. The children were lost and frightened by the time Peterson found them. He claimed his intentions were initially helpful. He brought them to the cabin, intending to give them water and then guide them back to the main trails. What happened next, according to Peterson's letter, was a tragic accident rather than a deliberate act. The cabin had a small propane heater that Peterson used during hunting season. The ventilation in the cabin was poor and the heater malfunctioned. Peterson claimed he had stepped outside briefly to gather firewood. When he returned less than 30 minutes later, all 3 children were unconscious. Despite his attempts to revive them, they did not survive. Peterson described his panic and his decision to hide what had happened rather than report it. He moved the bodies, burying them in a location he described with specific landmarks and coordinates. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly, removing any evidence that the children had been there. Then, he returned to town and said nothing, allowing the massive search effort to focus on areas far from where the children actually were. The letter explained why Peterson had confessed to his nephew, Detective Harold Morrison, several months after the incident. The guilt had become overwhelming, and Peterson needed someone in his family to know the truth. Morrison's response, according to the letter, was to protect his uncle rather than pursue justice. Morrison had verified Peterson's account by visiting the burial site alone. He had confirmed that 3 sets of remains were exactly where Peterson described. And then Morrison had made a choice that would corrupt the entire investigation. Rather than arresting Peterson or revealing the truth, Morrison decided to bury the evidence even deeper. He reasoned that Peterson was family, that the deaths were accidental rather than intentional, and that destroying an old man's final years would serve no purpose. The children were already gone. Nothing could bring them back. Prosecution would only create more victims, Morrison rationalized, tearing apart his own family in the process. To protect Peterson, Morrison needed to ensure the investigation never looked in the right direction. He deliberately focused attention on Grace Mitchell, the young teacher who made a convenient scapegoat. He minimized the importance of testimony from the parent volunteers that might have cleared her. He subtly influenced the narrative in news coverage. He created a paper trail that suggested he had thoroughly investigated all possibilities while actually ensuring that the most crucial evidence never came to light. Peterson died in 1967, taking his secret to the grave. Morrison continued his law enforcement career for another 2 decades, eventually retiring with commendations and community respect. He kept the letter hidden for nearly 50 years, unable to destroy it completely but unwilling to let it ever surface. The metal box in the floor contained the proof of his betrayal of duty, his complicity in a cover-up, and his destruction of an innocent woman's life. Patricia Morrison sat in her father's empty house, holding the letter with trembling hands, realizing that her father's entire career had been built on a foundation of lies. She faced an agonizing decision. She could destroy the letter as her father had chosen not to do, protecting his reputation and sparing her family the shame. Or she could bring the truth to light, finally giving the families of those 3 children the answers they had sought for 65 years, and clearing the name of a woman who had suffered decades of undeserved suspicion. After 2 days of internal struggle, Patricia made her choice. She searched for Grace Mitchell Parker and found her living in Portland, still alive at 88 years old. Patricia called her, introduced herself, and said something that would change both their lives. She told Grace that she had proof of what really happened to those 3 children, proof that Grace had been innocent all along, and proof that the investigation had been deliberately sabotaged by the very detective who should have been seeking truth. Grace's response was not relief or vindication. It was a cold, focused determination that surprised Patricia. Grace said she needed to see everything, study everything, and understand exactly how justice had been denied. She needed to document the corruption so thoroughly that no one could ever question the truth again. And to do that properly, Grace explained, she would need access to historical records, academic resources, and expert analysis that only a university affiliation could provide. Within months, Grace enrolled at Portland State University. Her academic focus was deliberately chosen to give her the tools she needed: understanding of 1950s police procedures, knowledge of evidence handling protocols, expertise in archival research methods, and credibility as a serious scholar rather than simply a bitter old woman making accusations. She would spend the next 6 years building an unassailable case, not just for her own vindication, but to ensure that the 3 children who died accidentally would finally be found, and the man who protected their killer would be exposed for what he was. But Patricia Morrison's discovery was only the beginning. The letter provided the framework of what had happened, but Grace would soon uncover evidence suggesting that Detective Morrison's corruption extended far beyond protecting one guilty relative, and that the truth about October 14, 1952, contained layers of deception even Peterson's confession had not revealed. Portland State University, September 2018 to May 2022. Grace Parker's enrollment at Portland State University raised eyebrows among administrators and faculty alike. At 89 years old, she was by far the oldest student to undertake a graduate degree in the history department's century-long existence. Her application materials were impeccable despite her age. She held a bachelor's degree in education from 1951, completed just before the events that would derail her teaching career. Her statement of purpose outlined a research interest in mid-century criminal justice procedures with an academic rigor that impressed the admissions committee. Professor Michael Harrison agreed to serve as her thesis advisor, initially viewing the arrangement as a humanitarian gesture toward an elderly woman seeking intellectual fulfillment in her final years. He quickly realized his assumption was entirely wrong. Grace approached her studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She attended every lecture, completed every assignment weeks ahead of schedule, and spent countless hours in the university library poring over materials that most graduate students would have found insufferably tedious. Her research methodology was meticulous and strategic. Grace began by studying criminal investigation standards and practices used in Oregon during the early 1950s. She examined training manuals for rural law enforcement, protocols for evidence collection and documentation, and procedures for interviewing witnesses and suspects. She became an expert on what investigators were supposed to do, creating a framework against which she could measure what had actually been done in her case. Next, Grace submitted formal requests to the Oregon State Archives for access to historical police records. Her status as a graduate student conducting legitimate academic research gave her access that might have been denied to a private citizen making personal inquiries. She specifically requested case files from Willow Creek and surrounding counties for the period between 1950 and 1955, framing her research as a comprehensive study of rural law enforcement practices in post-war Oregon. The archives delivered boxes of materials that Grace studied with forensic attention to detail. She created detailed timelines, cross-referenced witness statements, and identified inconsistencies that had been buried in the files for 7 decades. She discovered that Detective Morrison had filed reports claiming to have investigated several alternative theories about the children's disappearance. But the actual documentation supporting those investigations was minimal or non-existent. Grace found witness statements that had been taken but never followed up on. A delivery driver reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near a service road leading to the preserve's remote areas on the morning of October 14th. The statement was filed and apparently forgotten. A park ranger mentioned that several old hunting cabins existed beyond the preserve's official boundaries, areas that had never been systematically searched. His information was noted but not acted upon. Most significantly, Grace discovered glaring omissions in how the investigation had documented the parent volunteers' testimony. Margaret Henderson and Robert Chen had both provided statements strongly supporting Grace's account and confirming that she had followed all safety procedures. Yet Morrison's summary reports barely mentioned their testimony, instead emphasizing ambiguous statements from young children who had been confused and frightened during their interviews. Grace also found something else hidden in the archived materials: evidence logs that didn't match. Morrison had filed reports claiming certain areas of the preserve had been thoroughly searched and documented, but the corresponding evidence logs and photographs that should have supported those claims were missing or incomplete. It appeared that Morrison had created a paper trail suggesting comprehensive investigation while actually conducting a much more limited and selective inquiry. As Grace's academic work progressed, she began incorporating Patricia Morrison's letter and the information it contained into her analysis. She worked carefully, knowing that a deathbed confession letter discovered in suspicious circumstances might not carry legal weight on its own. She needed to corroborate Peterson's account through independent evidence and demonstrate that the official investigation had failed in ways that could only be explained by deliberate manipulation. Grace's thesis began taking shape as a devastating critique of the 1952 investigation. She documented systematic failures in protocol, unexplained gaps in evidence collection, and investigative decisions that contradicted standard practices. She built a case that Detective Morrison had not simply failed to find the missing children through incompetence, but had actively prevented their discovery through deliberate misdirection. Professor Harrison watched Grace's work evolve with growing unease. He recognized that she was not simply writing an academic thesis. She was constructing a legal brief, assembling evidence for a case that would eventually need to be presented to authorities. When he gently suggested that her work was becoming more investigative than historical, Grace acknowledged his observation with a thin smile and continued her research with even greater determination. In her 4th year of study, Grace made a breakthrough that transformed her investigation from historical analysis to active criminal case. She located surviving family members of Frank Peterson and requested interviews as part of her academic research. Peterson's grandson, Christopher Peterson, agreed to speak with her, curious about why a university researcher was interested in his long-deceased grandfather. During their conversation, Christopher mentioned that his grandfather had kept detailed journals throughout his life. The journals had been stored in the family's attic for decades, largely forgotten after Peterson's death in 1967. Christopher offered to let Grace examine them, seeing no harm in allowing an elderly academic access to old notebooks for historical research purposes. The journals proved to be exactly what Grace needed. Peterson had documented his activities with surprising detail, including entries from October 1952. His journal confirmed that he had been at Henderson Nature Preserve on the morning of the 14th, that he had encountered the 3 lost children, and that the events described in his deathbed letter had occurred essentially as he had written. But the journals also contained something the letter had not: detailed descriptions of conversations Peterson had with Detective Morrison in the months and years following the incident. These journal entries revealed that Morrison had done more than simply bury evidence. He had actively manipulated the investigation from within, steering resources away from productive search areas, discouraging witnesses from pursuing certain lines of inquiry, and quietly ensuring that the case remained unsolved. Morrison's motivation appeared to be protection of family reputation and avoidance of scandal, but the effect was a comprehensive obstruction of justice that had lasted decades. Grace now had multiple sources of evidence: the original case files showing investigative failures, Patricia Morrison's letter containing Peterson's confession, and Peterson's own journals documenting both the incident and the cover-up. She had built her case methodically, using academic research as a vehicle to gather materials that would have been difficult or impossible to obtain through other means. By the spring of 2022, Grace was ready to take the next step. She had completed her thesis, a 300-page document that was simultaneously a work of historical scholarship and a criminal investigation report. Her findings were clear and supported by extensive evidence. 3 children had died accidentally in 1952. Their deaths had been covered up by the perpetrator with help from a corrupt detective, and an innocent woman had been destroyed by an investigation that was designed to fail from the beginning. Grace submitted her thesis to her academic committee and simultaneously sent copies to the Oregon State Police, the county prosecutor's office, and the state attorney general. She was not interested in academic accolades or scholarly recognition. She wanted authorities to reopen the case officially, locate the remains of 3 children who had been missing for 70 years, and finally clear her name not through the passage of time, but through documented proof of her innocence and exposure of the conspiracy that had victimized her. The response from law enforcement was initially cautious. Reopening a 7-decade-old case based on the research of someone who had been a suspect in the original investigation raised obvious concerns about objectivity and credibility. But Grace's work was too thorough and too well documented to dismiss easily. The evidence she had assembled demanded serious examination, and the implications of what she had uncovered meant that ignoring her findings could create its own legal and ethical problems. In the summer of 2022, the Oregon State Police announced that they were conducting a review of new evidence related to the 1952 disappearance of 3 children from Willow Creek. They did not initially name Grace as the source of that evidence, but within the academic and legal communities, word spread quickly about what the 93-year-old graduate student had accomplished. What remained to be seen was whether Grace's research would lead authorities to the burial site described in Peterson's letter, and whether 7 decades of burial would have left any remains that could be positively identified and finally bring closure to families who had waited a lifetime for answers. Willow Creek, Oregon, September 2023. The Oregon State Police forensic team arrived at the coordinates specified in Frank Peterson's confession letter on a cool autumn morning that mirrored the weather conditions of 71 years earlier. The location was approximately 3 miles from Henderson Nature Preserve, on privately owned forest land that had changed hands several times since 1952. The current property owner, a timber company based in Seattle, had granted full access for the investigation after being contacted by state authorities. Grace Parker was not permitted at the excavation site. Her status as both a witness and a victim in the case created legal complications that investigators needed to avoid. She waited at a hotel in Willow Creek, the town she had fled 7 decades earlier, accompanied by her daughter Amanda Harrison and her attorney, a criminal defense specialist named Nicholas Martinez, who had agreed to represent her without charge after learning about her case. The forensic team began with ground-penetrating radar to survey the area Peterson had described in his letter. The technology had advanced dramatically since 1952, allowing investigators to detect disturbances in soil composition and density without immediate excavation. The radar imaging revealed anomalies consistent with a burial site approximately 4 feet below the current ground level. The depth was greater than Peterson had described, but 70 years of natural soil accumulation and decomposition could easily account for the difference. Lead investigator Detective Sarah Chen coordinated the excavation with the precision of an archaeological dig rather than a typical crime scene investigation. Every layer of soil was documented photographically and measured carefully. Evidence technicians sifted through dirt methodically, searching for any material that might provide identification or context. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring 3 full days of careful work before the team reached the depth where the radar had indicated disturbances. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, excavators uncovered the first evidence that Peterson's confession had been accurate. Fragments of deteriorated fabric appeared in the soil, consistent with children's clothing from the 1950s. Shortly after, small bone fragments were discovered, their size and characteristics consistent with juvenile remains. The forensic anthropologist on site, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to the deceased detective, confirmed that the fragments appeared to be human and belonged to individuals who had not reached full skeletal maturity. As excavation continued over the following week, investigators recovered remains from 3 distinct individuals. The preservation was poor after 7 decades of burial, but enough material survived to allow for analysis. Dr. Morrison estimated the individuals were between 7 and 10 years old at time of death based on bone development and dental characteristics. The positioning of the remains suggested they had been buried with care rather than simply disposed of, consistent with Peterson's account that he had felt remorse for the accidental deaths. Items found with the remains provided additional identification possibilities. A small metal lunchbox, severely corroded but with traces of paint still visible, matched descriptions from the 1952 case files. A child's wristwatch, stopped permanently at 11:17, corresponded with the timeline Peterson had described. Most significantly, dental records from 1952 had been preserved in the case files, and forensic odontologists were able to make preliminary matches based on the recovered dental remains. The forensic evidence supported Peterson's claim that the deaths had resulted from carbon monoxide poisoning rather than violence. Dr. Morrison found no indicators of skeletal trauma, no fractures or injuries that would suggest the children had been harmed intentionally. The cause of death appeared to be exactly what Peterson had described: a tragic accident involving a malfunctioning heater in an inadequately ventilated space, followed by a panicked cover-up rather than a deliberate act of violence. While the excavation proceeded in Willow Creek, investigators in Portland were conducting parallel research into Detective Harold Morrison's case files and career records. What they discovered painted a troubling picture of systematic corruption that extended beyond the single case of the missing children. Morrison had handled dozens of investigations during his career, and several showed similar patterns of incomplete documentation, unexplained gaps in evidence chains, and outcomes that seemed to favor certain individuals while disadvantaging others. A task force was assembled to review Morrison's entire career, searching for other cases where his personal interests might have influenced his professional conduct. The review uncovered at least 4 additional investigations where Morrison appeared to have protected suspects who had family or social connections to him while directing blame toward more vulnerable targets. The 1952 case was not an isolated incident of corruption, but rather part of a pattern that had persisted throughout Morrison's 3-decade law enforcement career. The implications were staggering. How many other people had been falsely suspected or convicted based on Morrison's corrupted investigations? How many guilty parties had escaped justice through his protection? The review was ongoing, but preliminary findings suggested that Morrison's betrayal of his oath had victimized multiple individuals over many years, and that the institutional oversight that should have detected his misconduct had failed repeatedly. For Grace Parker, waiting in Willow Creek for official confirmation of what she already knew to be true, the excavation represented far more than vindication. It meant that 3 children who had been lost could finally be returned to their families for proper burial. It meant that the truth about what happened on October 14, 1952, would finally replace decades of speculation and false accusation. And it meant that her own name, tarnished for 71 years, would be cleared not through the passage of time, but through documented proof of her innocence. DNA analysis of the recovered remains would take several additional weeks. Comparison samples would need to be obtained from surviving family members of Emily Watson, David Sullivan, and Rebecca Torres. The process would be complicated by the passage of 7 decades and the challenge of locating relatives who might not even know about the original case. But the preliminary evidence was already sufficient for investigators to reach an informal conclusion that the remains were almost certainly those of the 3 missing children. On September 28, 2023, the Oregon State Police held a press conference in Willow Creek. Detective Sarah Chen announced that remains recovered from a forested area near the town had been preliminarily identified as belonging to 3 children who disappeared in 1952. She confirmed that the investigation had been reopened based on new evidence provided by a former suspect in the case, and that the evidence conclusively demonstrated that person's innocence while implicating others in a deliberate cover-up that had lasted 7 decades. The press conference did not name Grace publicly, respecting her privacy at her attorney's request, but journalists quickly identified her as the source of the breakthrough. News outlets that had once published articles implying her guilt now scrambled to tell the story of how a 94-year-old woman had used academic research to expose one of the longest-running cover-ups in Oregon criminal justice history. Grace watched the press conference from her hotel room, her daughter sitting beside her holding her hand. She felt no triumph in the moment, only a profound exhaustion and a sense of loss for all the years that had been stolen from her by Morrison's lies. 3 children had died accidentally in 1952. That tragedy was not her fault and never had been. But the destruction of her life, her career, and her reputation had been a deliberate act of corruption by someone sworn to pursue justice. And that betrayal had taken 71 years to fully expose. The final chapter of Grace Parker's story would be written not in a courtroom or a police station, but on a university stage, as she prepared to receive a diploma that represented far more than academic achievement. It represented the completion of a mission that had consumed 6 years of intense work and 7 decades of patient waiting. But first, there was one more revelation waiting to emerge from the evidence, something even Grace had not anticipated, something that would transform her understanding of what had actually happened in October of 1952, and why Detective Morrison's cover-up had been even more calculated than anyone had realized. Portland State University, May 15, 2024. Grace Parker walked slowly across the stage of the Portland State University auditorium, her hand gripping the arm of Professor Michael Harrison for support. At 95 years old, every step required careful concentration, but her posture remained straight and her expression was composed. The audience of several thousand people rose in spontaneous applause that continued for nearly 2 minutes, an unprecedented display for a graduate ceremony where hundreds of students would receive their degrees that afternoon. The university president, Dr. Catherine Williams, personally presented Grace with her master's degree in history with highest honors. The diploma represented 6 years of intensive academic work, countless hours of research, and the kind of scholarly dedication that would have challenged someone a quarter of her age. But everyone in that auditorium understood that the piece of paper being handed to Grace represented something far more significant than academic achievement. The formal ceremony concluded without any public reference to the criminal investigation that had led to Grace's enrollment. The university had agreed to respect her privacy, allowing the day to focus on her scholarly accomplishments rather than her personal vindication. But a private reception had been arranged afterward in a smaller venue, where investigators, attorneys, and family members gathered to discuss the final resolution of the case that had consumed Grace's life for 72 years. Detective Sarah Chen presented the complete findings of the forensic investigation. DNA analysis had positively identified the remains recovered in September 2023 as belonging to Emily Watson, David Sullivan, and Rebecca Torres. The 3 children who had been missing since October 1952 had finally been found, and their remains had been returned to their families for burial. Services had been held in Willow Creek in March 2024, attended by surviving siblings, cousins, and descendants who had lived with the uncertainty of the disappearances for generations. The cause of death had been definitively established as carbon monoxide poisoning, exactly as Frank Peterson had described in his confession letter. Forensic analysis found no evidence of trauma, violence, or any indication that the deaths had been anything other than a tragic accident. Peterson's account of the malfunctioning heater in the poorly ventilated cabin had been corroborated by every piece of physical evidence recovered from the burial site. The investigation into Detective Harold Morrison's career had concluded with findings that were even more damaging than initially anticipated. The review of his case files had identified 7 separate investigations where Morrison had demonstrably manipulated evidence, protected suspects with personal connections to him, and directed suspicion toward innocent parties. The pattern was consistent and deliberate, representing not occasional lapses in judgment, but systematic corruption that had persisted throughout his entire law enforcement career. Most significantly, investigators had discovered something in Morrison's personal financial records that explained a previously puzzling aspect of the case. In November 1952, approximately 1 month after the children's disappearance, Morrison had received a cash payment of $5,000, a substantial sum equivalent to nearly a year's salary for a detective at that time. The payment had no legitimate explanation in his documented income sources. Further investigation revealed that the payment had come from the Willow Creek School District's insurance fund. The connection became clear when researchers examined the district's records from that period. The school district had been facing a potential lawsuit from the families of the missing children, who were preparing to claim that inadequate supervision during the field trip had contributed to whatever fate had befallen their children. Such a lawsuit could have bankrupted the small rural school district. Morrison's corruption had served multiple purposes. By protecting his uncle Frank Peterson from prosecution, he had shielded his family from scandal. By directing blame toward Grace Mitchell and away from any deficiencies in the school's safety procedures, he had helped the school district avoid a catastrophic legal judgment. And by accepting payment from the district's insurance fund, he had personally profited from the cover-up. The arrangement had been carefully constructed to serve Morrison's interests on multiple levels while destroying an innocent woman's life and denying 3 families the closure they deserved. The Oregon Attorney General's office issued a formal exoneration of Grace Parker in April 2024, a legal document explicitly stating that she bore no responsibility for the deaths of the 3 children and had been the victim of a corrupt investigation designed to protect the guilty while victimizing the innocent. The exoneration came 72 years after Grace had first been questioned as a suspect, and 71 years after she had fled Willow Creek to escape the weight of suspicion that had destroyed her teaching career. The families of Emily Watson, David Sullivan, and Rebecca Torres released a joint statement thanking Grace for her years of work to uncover the truth about their loved ones. They acknowledged that Grace herself had been a victim of the same tragedy that had taken their family members, and they expressed gratitude that she had lived long enough to see justice finally served. The statement contained no blame or resentment toward Grace, only recognition that she had suffered alongside them for 7 decades. Grace's own statement, read by her attorney at the private reception, was characteristically restrained. She expressed relief that the 3 children had been found and could finally be properly laid to rest. She acknowledged that her vindication came far too late to restore what had been taken from her. But she found satisfaction in knowing that the truth had been documented thoroughly enough that no one could ever question it again. She dedicated her academic work to the memory of Emily, David, and Rebecca, 3 children whose accidental deaths should never have resulted in decades of cover-up and corruption. Professor Michael Harrison spoke about Grace's scholarly work, emphasizing that her thesis represented a genuine contribution to the understanding of criminal justice failures and the importance of institutional oversight. The document had been submitted to multiple academic journals and law reviews, where it would serve as a case study in how corruption could persist for decades when proper safeguards were absent. Grace's work would be read by future generations of law enforcement professionals, prosecutors, and criminal justice reformers as an example of both the harm that corruption could cause and the importance of persistent pursuit of truth. The gathering concluded with Grace surrounded by her family, including 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren who had known nothing of their matriarch's past until her university enrollment had forced the story into the open. They had watched her spend 6 years consumed by research and investigation, initially confused by her obsession with events that had occurred before most of them were born. Now they understood that Grace had been fighting not just for her own vindication, but for justice for 3 children who had died accidentally and deserved to be remembered truthfully rather than as unsolved mysteries. Grace returned to her apartment in Portland the following day, her diploma framed and hanging on the wall beside photographs of her family. She had accomplished what she set out to do. The 3 missing children had been found. Detective Morrison's corruption had been exposed. Her own name had been cleared completely. The truth about October 14, 1952, was now part of the official record, documented so thoroughly that no one could ever again suggest that Grace Mitchell Parker bore any responsibility for that day's tragedy. In the final interview she granted before retreating from public attention, Grace was asked whether the 6 years of academic work and the achievement of her vindication had brought her peace. She considered the question carefully before responding. She explained that peace was perhaps too strong a word for what she felt. The 72 years of carrying false suspicion could not be erased by a diploma or an official exoneration. The teaching career she had loved had been taken from her at age 23 and could never be restored. The 3 children whose deaths had accidentally occurred under her supervision were still gone, and no amount of vindication could change that fundamental tragedy. But what Grace had achieved was something more important than peace. She had achieved truth. She had proven beyond any possible doubt that she had been innocent of wrongdoing, that the investigation that had destroyed her life had been corrupted deliberately, and that the real story of what happened in October 1952 was now documented so completely that it could never again be distorted or denied. For a woman who had lived 7 decades under the shadow of false suspicion, that truth represented a form of justice that had been worth waiting for, no matter how long it took. Grace Parker passed away peacefully in her sleep on November 3, 2024, at the age of 95, 6 months after receiving her master's degree. Her obituary, published in newspapers throughout Oregon, described her as an educator, scholar, and advocate for justice whose academic work had exposed one of the longest-running cover-ups in state history. The 3 children whose memories she had honored through her research were mentioned prominently, finally remembered not as unsolved mysteries, but as victims of a tragic accident whose truth had been buried for 72 years before a persistent old woman refused to let lies stand as history.